My name is Nikolaus Franz. I'm the oldest son from Nikolaus Franz and Anna Engel. I was born on the 27th of July, 1922. And I would like to record the history from the Franz family as much as I know them, so that the coming people are going to know where we come from and what reason we had that we migrated from one place to the other. I really don't know where to start. Maybe I, like they say it so nicely, let's start at the beginning. And I would like to start in the year 1981, when I closed the loop from the Franz family in Langenargen, close to, at the Bodensee. Langenargen is a little town that is recorded in the history for 1,000 years or more. Let's go back to that year, 1981. I was standing in front of the beautiful church of Langenargen. And my heart was pounding like if it would jump out of my chest. Because my ancestors left around 1755 from the city or town of Langenargen, and I'm about to close the loop, and I feel that I can only close that loop in that church. And I opened the door. There were not too many people inside, and I was struck with the beauty from the church from the inside. It was something that I've never seen before. Maybe it's only because of the moment. But I slowly start to walk into the church, and the tears just ran down my face, because I remembered, or I thought, what would my ancestors do here in the church? That was really the only place where they could go and complain to their God. And I kept on walking closer, and without looking right and left to the people that were standing or kneeling in that church. And when I came to the front and I saw the lights, I felt the time was such that we like I said, I wanted to put myself into the position from our ancestors when they went into the church to bring in front of their God whatever they felt the people did wrong to them. We researched in the church's archive. My brother and I, we researched in the church's archive the roots from our family, and we went back to 1465. That's the when they started to record what happened to the town of Langenargen. And I found that at one time one of our ancestors was the mayor from the little town, and then also I found that they in the church the light, the sanctuary lamp, was bought in 1500 and so many years from one of our ancestors, and that light is still burning in the church from Langenargen. So there is very little what we know about our family from there on until they emigrated down around 1755 down into the Bachka. And I would like to put myself into that time and discuss that. What reason did they have to make a decision like that and to leave the town where they lived for hundreds of years? Then the history tells us at that time the families got larger and larger, and they could hardly support themselves, and a lot of them had to go to work into Switzerland and into other parts of Germany, especially in the winter, to make some money. And the baron who owned them at that time, he insisted that they pay taxes on the money what they make outside. But in many cases, when there were 3 or 4 sons and daughters, only the oldest one would get that little bit of land what they had, while the other ones had to work. Then the other sons had to work for other farmers. And the daughters, if they couldn't find a husband who was a farmer, they had to then go and work for another farmer as well, where they became the farmer where they worked for became the owner of them. And in many cases they couldn't find a husband afterwards anymore, so they then if the farmer, he slept with them, and if they were unlucky that they had a child, they would have to, the farmer would pay them a little bit of money, and they would have to leave and find themselves another employment. And the sons, they could not get married because they could not support a family. So when the Austro-Hungarian crown looked for volunteers to go into the eastern provinces, what were after the war with the Turks, what were liberated, and there were then a lot of volunteers. The crown, the Austro-Hungarian crown, insisted on them being Catholics and to have that they are married, and so that they can start a family down where they went. So after the war with the Turks, around 1500 or 1720 or 25 or 30, after the war, the parts of the Bachka and Banat, they were empty. The Turks took their people with them while they killed off the rest. So there were very few people left there. So when the Austro-Hungarian Empire started to look for volunteers, like I said, there were a lot of volunteers around Langenargen, and not only around Langenargen, also in other parts of Germany what belonged to the so-called Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Holy Roman Empire. So how did that go about? The barons, what really didn't like to let the people go because they felt every one of them is a taxpayer. If they can keep them, then they can collect some taxes from them. But the Crown insisted that all the volunteers could be screened from the Crown. And in a way that went, they would have to go to Ulm on the Danube. And there they would put together when they arrived in Ulm, there were people that would put together rafts, and the family would build a little bit of a shack on it where the people could live in for the future and the dangers rafting or floating down to Vienna. The rafters, they were professionals. They went down into Vienna and then later on to the Bachka, and then after they delivered the people where they were supposed to go, then they went back up north again or up west and started a hope to find some other people that they could float down the Danube. But I'm ahead of myself. They loaded everything on a raft in Ulm on the Danube, and they themselves were really not used to, most of the people were not used to a life like that. But anyway, they floated then with the rafters. They floated down to Vienna. In Vienna, when they arrived in Vienna, they had to go to offices, and they were pre-recorded, so they knew that they are going to come. So when they arrived there, they had to go to offices, and it took about 8 days until all the papers were ready, and their lot was, they were told where to go and what lot they are going to inherit or get there from the Crown. They also, the Crown gave them a little bit of money. We really don't know how much, but so that they could buy themselves some seed and some, maybe a cow or something like that. It is not unclear. The amount of money was really unclear, and I'm going to look further into it, and if I do find it, I'm going to record it. And if anyway, when after everything was done and the parcel what they are going to get from the Crown down in the Bachka, then they started their journey, a dangerous journey down the Danube. And they would float then down into Hungary, and during the day they would float down, and in the evening they would go to the shores, because it was too dangerous at that time. The Danube was too dangerous for them raft to use the night as well. So in the evening when they came ashore, there were many times there were Hungarian barons. They would offer them something to stay there, because the people were really, there were not enough people to work the land in Hungary at that time. But the most of them, they just wanted to go into their dreamland, into their country where they are going to see the honey, the milk and the honey. Of course, they kept on going. By the time they reached their land, the people with their three-pointed hats, those were the German, and the Austrian were already there, the inspectors and so on, and they would then show them the place where they can build themselves a house. With that little bit of money what they got from from the crown, they then did hired some people that were already there to help them build a house. The houses were built. I have to go back. The rafts were disassembled, and the wood was used for building houses or a shed. And the reason for it was at that time it was all swamp, and very little trees grew. There were no forests on the north side of the Danube. What could have been used for building houses. So they brought their wood with themselves. They disassembled the rafts, and that wood was used for rafters. And the houses were built from clay. And in a way they went about, they dug the clay outside of town, and then they made frames where they put that clay in. They made it wet, and they put that clay in, and they stamped it down so that it got hard, and then they left it to dry. Once that was dry, then they lifted the frame up a little bit higher and did the same thing until they reached the height from 2 meters or maybe a little bit less. And then they put the rafters on top of it. Right away, they found themselves in a type of a land where they were not used to. They were used to where they came from. That was a healthy, fairly high ground. The most of the people, they came from, they were not used to that swamp. And it didn't take them long until they start to get sick from that swamp. But they then start to dig trenches and to drain that land, and it became very rich land in the future. But at the beginning, you can imagine how difficult it was for them to build the house and in that strange environment. And the water what they drank came almost from the surface. They dug some holes what they used as a well, and the water came just through the ground, and they could almost take it with a pail out and use it for everything whatever they needed the water for. The thing is that that water was really swampy water, and they were not used to it. They didn't have no immunity in their body, and one after the other became sick. What we would call today a swamp fever, from swamp fever. And it took one generation to develop immunity in their body against that swamp fever. And that's why the saying went, den ersten der Tod, den zweiten die Not und den dritten das Brot. That meant the first generation died from the hardship, and the second generation, they were so poor that they couldn't make a living, and then the third generation, they were the ones that reaped the profit or reaped from the sweat from the previous generations. But I'm way ahead of myself. When they arrived there were some, the people that were there were the Germans that were already there, what came before them, and the odd little town of Serbians. The Serbians, they came from the Turkish Empire, what had ran into difficulties with the Turks, and then they migrated up into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they stayed there. Then on the border, the first ones hoped that they are going to be able to go back, but that never happened anymore because the Turks stayed there for way too long, until the next generation, who didn't know where they came from anymore, they just stayed there, and that became then their place where they tried to make a living. It was very difficult for them to do that, to make a living in that strange land. And the France family, we always wondered. They were not farmers, really not farmers. They were millers, and they built a house about a kilometer from the Danube, and we always wondered why they would become miller, and why they would afterwards find to make their living on the Danube. But by researching where they came from Langenargen, we found that they were boat owners. They traded from Germany to Switzerland, across the Bodensee and back. They bought goods in Germany or Austria at that time, and traded it and sold it in Switzerland, and then bought goods there and brought them back, whatever they could sell over here. And it was interesting to find that they did not forget that. They kept on later on to make their living on the water. But I'll come to that. I would like to start at the beginning where they arrived. And after they built the house, what was still standing, 1944, with some changes, the roof was changed, but the house, the walls still stood from the very first ones, from the first friends that arrived there. And they built themselves a mill, and in a way that was, they had one stone, a huge stone, a round stone on the bottom, and one on top, and they fed the grain into it, and a stone was turned by a horse. The horse had the eyes closed so that he could walk around in a circle, and he turned around that huge stone, what then made the flour. Of course, the flour everything was mixed into the grain. It wasn't that the flour was like it was later on. It was the bran, and everything was in that flour. And it was what we know today. It was a very healthy bread, what they made out of that flour. And they also did get some land. And the land what they had, they worked beside that mill. They planted a vineyard outside of town, and my grandfather, Andreas Franz, he built then a mill on the Danube. It was a floating mill on the Danube, and it was powered by the water in the Danube.